Again, I think that would be very good for our country and something that we owe to the men and women who are serving in the military and to the families. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of the time.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for the remainder of the hour as a designee of the Majority Leader.
How much time? 40 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So much going on in this country. So many great folks, some that not so much. There are stories out indicating that this administration is considering releasing the blind sheik. He's credited with helping mastermind the first attempt to bring down our World Trade Centers. He is credited as the Islamic fanatic who issued the fatwa that was considered by the radical extremist jihadists to justify killing thousands and thousands of Americans. What they hoped would be tens of thousands of Americans in the World Trade Center and in the Pentagon. One report indicated that with regard to the Pentagon, if the plane had not just brushed across a berm outside the parking lot before it hit, probably would have gone all the way into the interior, doing massive amount more damage than it actually did. Because of the valiant work of so many first responders, there weren't tens of thousands killed in the World Trade Centers, but the loss of 3,000 murdered because of some religious fanatics, the blind sheik being one of them. But the story's out yesterday and today that the administration is considering the release of the blind sheik and other American murderers so that we can obtain the complete release from Egypt of people that went there to try to help the Egyptians have free and fair elections. And in return for going there and providing the billions of dollars this country does to Egypt and continues, in return, the people in charge that this administration welcomed in charge of the Egyptian government as they stabbed an ally with whom they had written agreements named Mubarak. Not saying he's a great man, I'm saying this country, this administration had agreements with that man, and this administration broke those agreements, stabbed him in the back, and as a result now we have Americans in harm's way, some of them in the embassy in Egypt, and now the reports are that the administration is considering releasing murderers, people who planned and were complicit in murders and attempted murders of Americans. And this administration is considering releasing them and may be negotiating that. Now, I'm hoping that this report is what this administration has done many times, and that is release a trial balloon to see how people react. And if people react violently enough, verbally that is, against it, then they will say, hey, no, we never planned to do that. And I'm hopeful that that will be the case here. People who have been responsible for murdering and attempting to murder Americans have no business being used as bargaining chips. If the rule of law, if justice is going to mean anything in this country going forward, we cannot be bargaining with American liberty. Now, some of us recall very well in 1979 when an act of war occurred by the people, by the government of Iran in Tehran against an American embassy. Everyone's idea of international law indicates that the soil on which an embassy exists is the soil of that country. You attack the embassy, you have attacked that country. And it was my recollection, and those of us that were stationed at Fort Benning at the time, we knew it meant that many of the people, many of us at Fort Benning may have been sent to Iran if a war broke out. Everyone was watching to see if, as the term was used, the flag were to go up, who's going to go? Nobody was dying to go, but everyone was willing to go and die in defense of our country. The Carter administration instead began pleading with the Iranian government to let our hostages go. It was my recollection back during the time as we watched from Fort Benning, not sure what the fate of those of us at Fort Benning would be, but the spokesman for the Iranian government kept saying, the students have the hostages, the students attacked the embassy. And it just seemed to me, as a captain in the Army at the time, you know what it sounds like? The Iranian government is trying to give themselves a back door so that if President Carter stands up and finally becomes a great leader and shows great leadership and stands up and said, all right, you're saying that the students have the American hostages, well then here's the deal. An act of war has been committed, and either you deal with those students and you get those American hostages released, or we're bringing the full weight of the American military against Tehran for the release of those people. And if those hostages are harmed before we get there, then we will overthrow your government and we'll leave. We're not going to nation build. You can pick whatever government you want. It's your business unless you attack the United States of America. Because when you attack the United States of America, it is our business. We won't nation build, but we will take down any government of any nation anywhere that commits an act of war against us. That's what President Carter should have done. And now these rumors swirl around, these reports from media resources that tell us they're reliable, that this government now is thinking, well, maybe we'll dodge what the Carter administration did that got President Carter defeated for a second term. Maybe if we just release murderers of Americans, maybe if we'll just give them whatever they want, they'll release these people or allow them to leave the embassy and travel back to America, and we'll be okay. Wrong. You release people who declared war on America, who declared war on the World Trade Centers, on New York City, on Washington, D.C. You release those people. You have not made America safer. You've endangered far more lives than you got released. I like Ray LaHood. He's a good man. We haven't agreed on some things, but he's a good man. I know that. And it broke my heart when I saw that his wonderful son, who believes in liberty and freedom, were being kept against his will from leaving Egypt. He went over there to help them have a free and fair election. But from what I know, having not met Ray's son, I don't think he would want the lives of tens of thousands or millions of Americans jeopardized because this administration might be trying to avoid losing an election as President Carter did. The thing to do is the thing President Carter didn't try. He tried the negotiations. He offered all kinds of things. But the thing to do is say, Egypt, we have given you American treasure. We supported your efforts at electing leaders, but here's the deal. We sent you people to help you have free and fair elections, and if you are going to hold them hostage, then that's an act of war on us. And we will come to Egypt. We're not going to go to war with the nation. The whole nation of Egypt is not against America. But if the regime in power is going to take Americans who came over there to help them, who were participating in helping a process so that Egypt could continue to get U.S. funds to stabilize their country, if they're going to declare war on those individuals, then we'll take out that group that's presiding, attempting to govern. We won't nation build, but we will allow you put whatever government you want in place. But if they come against America, we'll come against that government. Not against the people, but against the government. We'll take that government out, and then you pick some other government. We don't care who it is. We don't care what kind of government you have, as long as they're not at war with America. But you commit these kind of criminal acts of war against American citizens, against America, we'll take that group out that's governing in that manner, and then you find one that won't declare war on America. That's what needs to be done. Not releasing the blind sheik, not releasing American murderers. That is not the thing to do. And I hope and pray that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of American lives will not be jeopardized by this administration just hoping to avoid a hostage crisis like arose in Tehran. That arose because of a weak administration refusing to do what it should have in response to an act of war. Because what we saw after those initial periods where they said, no, the students have we're trying to negotiate, we're trying to work with them. Well, eventually they saw this administration was not, the Carter administration was not going to do anything. And so they began saying, we have the hostages, and started making demands and threats and things like that. The thing to do is say, look, we want to live at peace with every nation in the world, but you declare war on Americans, we will take that government out and let the people choose whatever kind of government they want. We should not be nation building. You pick what government you want, and we'll live at peace as long as they don't declare war on us. They do, we're coming. We'll take them out. And then you pick your next government. That's what should be done, not the release of murders of those complicit in American murders, such as the blind sheik. I hope that enough people in America will rise up, Mr. Speaker, and make their voices heard. Don't be releasing people who declared war on America, who have American blood on their hands. We do not want to put the future of America in foreign hands that are covered with American blood. That is not the course to take. One other thing I want to mention before I get to a tribute, and that is with regard to the Selma March, that is with regard to the civil rights movement. There are some in America who think people like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, others who were such participants in the civil rights movement. People see that and say, well, that was a movement by blacks or African Americans, you know, to try to have equal civil rights. But having read a great deal about Martin Luther King Jr., it's very clear. This was a Christian minister, an ordained Christian pastor. And I haven't heard anybody in the wonderful tributes that have been paid here today as we commemorate that march in Selma. Hadn't heard anybody mention this. But as a Christian minister, those Martin Luther King Jr. and those who participated did more than help African Americans move closer toward having full equality, toward equal rights. He did more than that. For those of us who were young, white Christians, for those who would come behind us as Euro-Americans, white Americans, they did something wonderful for us. They created an environment in which all Christians, whites, all Christians, would be able to treat brothers and sisters as being brothers and sisters. They did a great service for all Americans. And so I'll end my voice, such as it is, in tribute for the service that was done for all Americans, and anxiously long for the day, we're getting so close, but long for the day when people are judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, where there are no quotas, is no need for a Justice Department to review everything because people are acting and treating each other in ways of equality, so that we finally achieve the dream. Now I want to turn to a tribute to a great man. This nation and freedom has lost a great proponent and defender. Andrew Breitbart, who is reported to have died this early morning in California, was and is an American hero of mine. This man, in what appeared to be in the prime of his life, knew that the key to keeping our endowed freedoms was shining the bright rays of sunlight on whatever issue was stealing away our nation's prosperity and liberties. Many came to know Andrew as the brains and the will behind the exposure of a cancer on our system that was exemplified by some of the things going on with Acorn, where they were not bothered by the thought of underage girls being placed in the bondage of sexual prostitution. They were not bothered by the idea of getting people in the country illegally for immoral and illegal purposes. He figured out a way to deal with these issues and to address what was sucking the nutrients and the life from this host country is really a cancer. He figured out how to shine sunlight inside offices of what was happening and gave a good dose of chemotherapy to the cancer. He also innovated ways to expose the extreme bias within many in the media that was holding itself out as being objective. We have freedom of speech, we have freedom of the press, but there should be some degree of honesty. If someone is expressing an opinion, it should be reflected as an opinion and not as unbiased journalism. Andrew had been in the process of exposing that, as well as so many other issues that were weakening our nation and infringing on our liberties, were deceiving rank-and-file Americans of the truth in our factual history. Andrew was serving as a clarion call to action for honorable Americans across the country to seek truth, justice, and the American way. In visiting numerous times with Andrew, he was so excited. He could see that he was literally and profoundly making a difference for truth. Often when innovators or impassioned, innovative, visionary people depart this world, they have not had the benefit of seeing any of the fruits of their labor. God had favored Andrew with a glimpse of the difference that he was making. In this book, and I acquired this copy from the Library of Congress, Righteous Indignation by Andrew Breitbart. This is a new conclusion to Andrew's recent books. He wrote this new conclusion himself. These are Andrew's words. I love my job. I love fighting for what I believe in. I love having fun while doing it. I love reporting stories that the complex refuses to report. I love fighting back. I love finding allies. And, famously, I enjoy making enemies. 3 years ago, I was mostly a behind-the-scenes guy who linked to stuff on a very popular website. I always wondered what it would be like to enter the public realm to fight for what I believe in. I've lost friends, perhaps dozens, but I've gained hundreds, thousands, who knows, of allies. At the end of the day, I can look myself in the mirror and I sleep very well at night. He now sleeps in the arms of God. Andrew was being demonized by those who were profiting from their deceptions of people and their cronyism with the government. He was rallying like-minded Americans to seek and take back the liberties with which they were endowed and upon which liberties' vast encroachments have been occurring. I would like to speak straight from the heart, but I typed these lines up just moments ago because of the difficulty. It's easier to read. But let me finish with what I wrote moments ago. Andrew had 2 films coming out in the near future, of which he was so proud, as he showed me and my friend Steve King here the trailers very recently. Those films can and will be quite powerful in furthering the cause of sunlight on darkness, though they may now have to be modified because of his passing. But Andrew was so kind to be an encourager to my daughter in California, was always complimentary of her when we talked. He knew how to make a father proud. In considering Andrew's works, the life and death of John Quincy Adams comes to mind. Adams had been elected president in 1824, first son of a former president to be so elected. In 1828, he was defeated by Andrew Jackson. In 1830, John Quincy Adams did the unthinkable. He had been president of the United States, and yet he was driven by a God-placed feeling of need to stop slavery in America. So, After having been president, he lowered himself to run for the House of Representatives and was elected in 1830, sworn in 1831, and served until 1848, just down the hall in what we now call Statuary Hall. He was a driven man. He believed God had called him, as he did William Wilberforce, to bring an end to slavery. Wilberforce in the British Isles, the United Kingdom, and Adams in America. He was concerned appropriately that it would be difficult to expect God to keep blessing America if we were putting brothers and sisters in chains and bondage. He gave powerful speeches over and over down the hall in trying to convince the other members of the House to pass bills that would end slavery, that would free slaves, and he never got it done. In fact, at one point, he had so alienated the Rules Committee, they passed a rule. He couldn't even bring those types of bills anymore, so then he had to fight the rule so he could go back to filing bills to end slavery and free slaves. And eventually he did. And he preached those powerful sermons down the hall against slavery. In 1846, a young man, not particularly handsome, some at Gettysburg that heard him years later said he didn't have all that pleasing a voice to listen to. He didn't have a beard at that time, but a young, skinny, some would say homely-looking guy was on the back row just down the hall of the House of Representatives. Adams liked this guy. Adams was not necessarily referred to as being a warm and fuzzy, cozy kind of guy, easy to warm up to, a bit cantankerous at times, but he liked Lincoln. In 1848, having spent so many years devoted to many great causes, but particularly to the cause of trying to end slavery, sitting at his desk, John Quincy Adams had a massive stroke. He was moved back into the Speaker's suite, just off the floor, died 2 days later. 1848. 13 years later, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as President of the United States. It was reported that someone had asked Lincoln, was there anything memorable that happened to you during your 2 brief years in the House of Representatives? He was reported to have said, in essence, not other than those powerful speeches of John Quincy Adams on the evils of slavery. Lincoln knew it was wrong. It tore at his soul that slavery existed in America. After he lost, after one term, went back, tried to make a little money, did, practiced law, represented the railroad some. But the Compromise of 1850 allowed new states to come in that would have slavery. Lincoln had thought perhaps he was done with slavery, but he couldn't stand it. He got back involved in politics, lost again, got elected president, and then helped bring about an end to slavery in the United States. John Quincy Adams did not bring an end to slavery as he had hoped, but he profoundly affected that young, skinny, less than handsome-looking guy named Abraham Lincoln. Andrew Breitbart is gone. That's the report. Be interested to see what the autopsy says. But I can't help but think his devotion to truth, to preserving liberty, will have inspired so many who will pick up that banner and potentially, as was the case with John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln, do far more than Adams himself could have done. And in this day, in the years to come do more than Andrew could have done by himself. Though Andrew did great service to himself, his family, and his nation, it's my prayer that his greatest contribution to this, the greatest nation, with the greatest freedoms in the history of the world, will not be those specific but amazing accomplishments he achieved, but that his greatest accomplishment will be the inspiration he was and is to so many who saw his devotion, saw his commitment, saw his goals and will, just as did John Quincy Adams, and accomplished more through those he inspired than those he could ever have accomplished individually. At a time like this, there is sometimes a temptation to blame God and ask, why did God take such an individual so soon? Our directed comments to our Creator should instead be, thank you, dear God, for the gift of Andrew Breitbart. We wish we could have kept him longer, but thank you for this marvelous gift. God be with his family, comfort his family. Andrew be sorely missed by seekers of truth. His departure will be welcomed by those he was exposing, but they shouldn't be too comfortable. He was a patriot. He was a lover of liberty. He was a lover of family. He was a lover of God, a lover of this nation. He was also a friend and encourager to me. With that, I would yield to my friend Steve King from Iowa.
I want to thank the gentleman from Texas. Timing of circumstances, Mr. Speaker, brought me to the floor here simultaneous with this wonderful tribute that Mr. Gohmert has provided to Andrew Breitbart and the life and the things that he stood for and believed in. I don't know how I can add to the completeness of the message that Louis Gohmert has delivered here. I had the privilege of calling Andrew Breitbart my friend as well. And I think of the last time Louis Gohmert, Steve King, and Andrew Breitbart were in the same room. And it was over in the place that I affectionately call the bunker, the house a couple of blocks east of the Supreme Court. Very fitting, by the way. Just almost within gaze of the east portico of the Supreme Court, where Moses sits there looking down upon all of humanity with the tablets on his knees, with the Ten Commandments in his arms, and saying to all the world, we're a nation of laws, not a nation of men, and that our laws come from God, and this profound belief in that. And as we were there, I remember I was invited to a dinner over at Breitbart's. Now, some might think that a dinner with Andrew Breitbart could be somebody sitting at the table with cufflinks, for example. It's possible, but it's unlikely that there's actually going to be a table. It's more likely that there's a counter in the middle of the kitchen, and on that counter and on the counter over on the wall were refreshments of all kinds, teetotaling and non-teetotaling refreshments. On the other counter are ribs and chicken. I think the ribs were there for Louis Gohmert personally. He and I are the only two members of Congress, and in that room is a constant din. And within that din, you'd always know what was on Andrew Breitbart's mind. Whenever he spoke, there was always an ear tuned to that. But he was very much a person engaged in the moment. He was driven to no end. I know when I walked in the room, he played a trumpet with his hand, just to get the attention in that din now that I'd arrived. But what I remember was that it was an engaging conversation about liberty and freedom of the press and truth, justice, and the American way, as Louis has said. And when it was all done, the refreshment bottles were empty and the ribs and chicken were bones, and we'd had one of the most engaging evenings you could ask for to have in Washington, D.C., and we have some here. That, I think, does describe Andrew Breitbart's life, engaging. I don't know who was more engaged than Andrew Breitbart. And I look back at it, just for example, this morning, I got up and I got ready to go, and I changed my pen over here, and I put my Constitution in my pocket here, and I put my keys in this pocket. And other than that, the only one other constant was I had to look around this morning, and I couldn't find it. And I went over to my backup storage, and I pulled this out and put it in my pocket this morning. And let the record show, Mr. Speaker, this is an acorn. I've carried this acorn, an acorn, around in my pocket for about 2 years. I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for the influence of Andrew Breitbart. In fact, we might not even know about the threat to the underpinnings of our Constitution, the legitimate electoral process we have in this country, if it hadn't been for Andrew Breitbart. Hannah Giles and James O'Keefe came together, and they went out and got some brilliant tape of the unconscionable activities of ACORN that produced over 400,000 false or fraudulent voter registrations. How many other false votes went up, we don't know. But my belief is, and I believe Andrew's belief was, that the Constitution is the foundation of American liberty, but underneath that foundation it sits on the bedrock of legitimate elections, and any entity that threatens those legitimate elections threatens the very Constitution itself and American freedom. And it was Andrew's brilliance that took those tapes of Hannah's and James and said, you roll these out, they will discredit you, they will attack you, you will be under the heat like you've never seen before in your life. We need to give them a little bit, and then they'll attack you and say that's the only one. It's an anomaly. Really, the tapes of the unconscionable actions of ACORN would be discredited immediately. It was Andrew that put together the strategy. First, you have to know the man to know that you have instant confidence that he knows. And he instantly thinks ahead. He never was, I don't think, a linear thinker. He always was a conceptual thinker. Some might go A, B, C, and maybe can get their way to Z. Andrew could go A, here's Z, and you know he knew every letter in between and how they were rearranged. He could see the strategy in an instant, and he could inspire you to step forward to that. That was part of the brilliance of Andrew Breitbart. That's one of the reasons I will carry this acorn in my pocket until they are gone. And then, as I put out this, just as when I sat and thought about the life of Andrew, and I wrote these words down to try to describe him, and words do not describe the man that Andrew was. I use the words dynamic, brilliant, fearless, visionary, altruistic, passionate, unconventional, trailblazer, patriot, lost friend. All of those things describe Andrew Breitbart, and many, many more. And as Louis Gohmert has said, his influence will be cascade across this civilization and this culture, I believe, in perpetuity, just like the influence of John Quincy Adams has had that influence. And I want to say also is that Andrew had a real sense of righteous indignation. The righteous indignation of when the Obamacare debate was taking place here, and the effort was staged to cast aspersions on the Tea Party as being racist. And I remember in the middle of that press gaggle when they said, what do you think? Somebody was hollering the N-word out at the Congressional Black Caucus as they walked across the grounds. I said, who has reported that? And they named that. Who actually heard it? They couldn't name me who heard it. Andrew Breitbart understood that it was a manufactured story created to discredit the Tea Party, and put $100,000 on the table for anybody that could produce an audio or a video that would confirm the false allegations of racial epithets being thrown by the Tea Party at anybody. He shut that story down, and he has provided us tremendous amount of credibility for the Tea Party in the process. Pigford Farms, another story. The list goes on. Andrew Breitbart understood the science behind the communications in the world. He understood the Internet before many even knew the Internet existed. He understood its potential. He had opened that up with big everything, with big ideas and global ideas, and them grounded in the full spectrum constitutional conservatism with an effort to provide protection for the rights of everybody as God gives us those rights. I am also tremendously saddened by the loss of our good friend, and some of us see ourselves, and it's a big Breitbart family that grieves today, and prays that he will be nestled in the hands of God, and his close family will be well taken care of and energized and nurtured by the profound belief that they've had a wonderful privilege to have Andrew Breitbart as their father, husband, friend, and that his influence moves on, and we dedicate ourselves to a renewed effort to follow through on those efforts, and we will seek to do what we can to match and emulate the brilliance of Andrew Breitbart. And I appreciate my friend Louis Gohmert coming to the floor and starting this beginning of a national conversation about the long reach of Andrew Breitbart. It reaches into the future, and I thank Andrew for his life. I thank God for Andrew's life. I thank Louis Gohmert for yielding to me.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio. Our time is expiring, so in conclusion, we pay tribute to a big man who is now, as Jesus said of the poor man Lazarus, he has now been carried to the bosom of Abraham by the angels. With that, I yield back.
Chair announces the Speaker's reappointment pursuant to Section 703 of the Social Security Act, 42 U.S.C. 903, and the order of the House of January 5, 2011, and upon the recommendation of the Minority Leader, of the following member on the part of the House to Social Security Advisory Board for a term of 6 years.
Ms. Barbara Kennelly of Hartford, Connecticut.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I come to the floor today to begin a series of half-hour conversations containing information that I believe many members of our House simply do not have, especially considering how often the Constitution and the framers are cited. I have no reason to believe that there is any intention on the part of any member to deny democracy to any American citizens in our great country. So during these half-hour special orders, I will be offering some evidence and information that go all the way back to the framers and come forward into the era when the District of Columbia was granted home rule, in order to try to inform members of the standing of the District of Columbia, which is often referred to as the federal district. It, of course, is not a federal district. It is a hometown of 600,000 residents, which has been granted full and complete authority to govern itself. Too late, of course, but finally. Too late in this era, but not too late in the history of the country, because as the country began, the citizens indeed at that time had that right. The framers, of course, were confronted with a dilemma. They wanted a capital to be located here in the District of Columbia, and they wanted that capital to have the same rights as any other Americans. They had had an experience in Philadelphia where there was some concern when veterans had marched on that capital about who would defend the capital, and they tried to sort out this dilemma and thought they had by creating the District of Columbia with the same rights as every other American citizen, but giving the Congress authority over the district. And let me indicate how that happened. No one who has any knowledge of the history of our country can believe that the framers fought against representation against taxation without representation for everybody except the people who happen to live in the nation's capital. That would be a sacrilege to say that of the great framers of the Constitution, particularly since people from this very area now known as the District of Columbia went to war on the slogan of no taxation without representation and fought and died under that slogan. They didn't go and die under that slogan so that everybody but themselves could be freed from England and have full democracy. It's also clear from looking at the Constitution, where there were 2 Maryland and 2 Democratic signers who made clear that in the land they gave to the District of Columbia, they weren't giving away their citizens' rights. And so their citizens in Maryland and Virginia during the 10-year transition period, in fact, voted for members of this body and had the right to vote in Maryland and Virginia. Some would call what Congress has done in intervening years an abuse of power. I believe it is a failure to come to grips with what the framers intended. Madison, Federalist 43, James Madison says at the very beginning, from the very beginning, and I'm quoting his words, that there would be a municipal legislature for local purposes derived from their own suffrage. That's, of course, the man and the document we rely on when we need some legislative history about the Constitution. It is very important to note that the first government in the city of Washington was established in 1802 when the District of Columbia became the nation's capital. At the time that the city was created as the nation's capital. At that point, contemporaneous with the Constitution, there was a city council elected by the people of the District of Columbia to fully govern this city the way the districts and the jurisdictions of the members of this body are fully governed. In 1812, the city council was permitted to elect the mayor. Before that, the mayor was appointed. And in 1820 and thereafter, the mayor was elected by the people. That continued into 1871. It should be said that the status of the District of Columbia until Home Rule was granted was constantly a part of the mix of the long tortured part of our history about racial segregation. Many of the perpetrators who denied Home Rule were Southern Democrats. It was only when a Southern Democrat, after the Voting Rights Act was passed, was defeated, that the district was granted Home Rule in 1973. So this has not been a matter of parties. If anything, the Republican Party had much cleaner hands until recently, when, for its own purposes, it adopted the posture of deciding that there would be Home Rule when it decided, and when it wanted that there would be no Home Rule, would violate every standard, every principle of the framers and founders, and simply step in and try to abolish democratic policy and laws enacted by local government to which they were not accountable. It's important to note that when the Home Rule Act was passed in 1973, the first line said that was the purpose was to restore the District of Columbia. Restore. Those words, I think, were chosen with great meaning and understanding of history restore, because it was clear that the people who lived in this territory had every right of every other American citizen before the city was created, that those from Maryland, Virginia who gave the land saw to it that that right was preserved, and that only in the political maneuverings of the Congress itself was that right at risk, and that right has never been at risk except at the mercy of members of Congress who did not adhere to the principles of full democracy for every citizen of the United States. So the purpose of the Home Rule Act was to restore, not create rights. No one creates rights for people born in this country. The rights are given with their citizenship. Now, the District of Columbia, if one looks at the Home Rule Act and at the trends of all of the legislation preceding the Home Rule Act, was never given partial home rule. Never given home rule except when members of Congress from other jurisdictions decide they want to make changes. That is found nowhere in the Home Rule Act, and that flies in the face of every principle of those who created the United States of America and those who died under the slogan of no taxation without representation. And so we created a very diverse democracy, and we have held it together through a principle of local deference and local control. So we have people in one part of the country that detest some of the laws and policies in another part of the country, but the first thing they will do is honor local control and the right of local citizens to elect people who are accountable to them, and when those who are not accountable to them want to get something done, they must go to those who are indeed accountable to them. Congress thought about what enacting home rule would mean. And it said, well, there are some specific exceptions. Congress did not leave it to the discretion of members of this body to decide what those exceptions would be. Congress, in fact, did something very specific with respect to those exceptions, because it understood that once home rule is granted, there would be differences between the local legislature and the Congress of the United States. So it said, look, this is what we mean, and this is what we do not mean. These limitations on the district and its council need to be rehearsed and need to be understood by anybody who believes in democracy as a principle here in the United States as much as we believed in it when all of us stood up for democracy in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East and around the world. We've got to make sure that we're not seen as hypocrites, because we are the first to rise when there is democracy that is ignored elsewhere and appear to deny it in our own country. That is something the world will never understand. So, the Congress, recognizing the differences, spelled out what the exceptions would be. And you can imagine why the exceptions were there. They have almost nothing to do with anything that a local legislature would want to enact. Occasionally they do. And the district simply cannot do it because it's in the Home Rule Act, and the district does not do it because it's in the Home Rule Act. For example, the District of Columbia cannot impose any tax on the property of the United States or any of the several states. Well, that's important because the property that is most valuable, the property that would yield the most revenue, is located in the center monumental core of the United States, and the District of Columbia would have not a thing to worry about if it could tax that property. Cannot be done. The District of Columbia cannot lend the public credit, the credit of the local jurisdiction, for support of any private undertaking. The district cannot impose any tax, partial or whole, on the personal income of individuals not resident of the state, of the District of Columbia, rather. Now, I emphasize that one because that's one that the local citizens most resent. It's called a commuter tax. What it means is if you come into the District of Columbia, as hundreds of thousands do from the surrounding region, use the resources, the roads, partake of the very public amenities that residents do. Nevertheless, said the Home Rule Act, nevertheless, the District of Columbia may not impose any commuter tax. Though the district, of course, resents that because there are commuter taxes all over the United States. But the district isn't asking to overturn the Home Rule Act. It's simply asking that Congress abide by the Home Rule Act. Maybe at some point Congress would want to reconsider this matter. I think my good friends of both parties from Maryland and Virginia would not want this matter reconsidered. But at the moment, I haven't heard anyone cry out that this is the reason that you find people in the District of Columbia engaging in civil disobedience when Congress intervenes into local affairs in the District of Columbia. Yes, this is a local matter, but it involves other Americans. And so the Home Rule Act would say, look, we want you to have as much, and I'm trying to be fair, those who wrote it would say, look, we want you to have as much jurisdiction, as much authority over your own business as you can. But once you go to taxing those from another region, well, we're going to draw the line. Well, the district resents it, but there is at least a theory for why that was done. There is no theory for trying to overturn a law of the District of Columbia simply because you disagree with it. Pure and simple. No theory that can be mustered, and certainly not from the framers, who were clear that every citizen of the United States, including those who lived in the nation's capital, would have the full democracy they fought for in the Revolutionary War. The District of Columbia has a Height Act. Though many in the city would like to build high, the Home Rule Act recognizes that the monumental core has its own federal meaning, because that's where the monument and the Capitol and the rest, and they did not want those buildings which are central to our identity as a nation overpowered by the kind of tall buildings, even skyscrapers, we see in other big cities. And there frankly has not been a great deal of of concern about that. Indeed, D.C. has its own height limit. The height limit helps the city when it comes to tourism. We, too, want everyone to see the monumental core, though you will find a healthy number of citizens here who would like to build as they build in other cities. We are not trying to overturn the Home Rule Act. We're trying to get observance of the Home Rule Act. And when you pass a law that, for example, says no funds may be used on something because it offends my personal predilection, you then are violating the most basic principle of any democracy. And that is why I have come to the floor and will be coming to the floor throughout the year. The District of Columbia may not enact any regulation or law having to do with any federal court, any court of the United States. That's true of any jurisdiction. And there are a number of others. We can't elect, the district cannot enact any law having to do with the National Zoo. Well, that's a federal zoo. And I'm not sure why someone was concerned about that, but that's in the Home Rule Act, and you're not going to find the district mayor or city council or residents going to the streets over the zoo. They went to the streets because they passed a law. That law had members of this House who sought to overturn it, and with respect to at least one of them have succeeded. And that is a shame on democracy. Because if you were to ask the citizens of the United States or of any place in the world whether or not any member of this body should be able to overturn a law passed by the local council of the District of Columbia in a democratic fashion, you would find almost nobody in this country who would say yes, and you would find almost nobody in the world that would say anything but, you cannot be serious. You who preach democracy all over the world. If these are your principles, the place and the time to apply them is right here, right now at home. Now, it is interesting to know that there was a lot of controversy until finally the Home Rule Act was passed, and it is no accident that the Home Rule Act was passed during the period of the 60s and 70s when the great civil rights laws were passed. The country came to understand that you can hardly have civil rights laws and then have people in your own country who have no mayor, no city council, no right to vote for local government, no vote in this body, and still call yourself a democracy. All of that came together in the 60s and the 70s. So I'd like to refer to two presidents from that era, the so-called Home Rule era. You will find that every president of the era, in the era, post-war era, agreed with the notion that the District of Columbia should have unlimited right to self-government except for the expressed and specific exceptions in the Home Rule Act. It is Richard Nixon who signed the Home Rule Act. Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, in his message on Home Rule, made these comments: "Our federal, state, and local government rest on the principle of democratic representation. The people elect those who govern them. We cherish the creed declared by our forefathers: no taxation without representation. We know full well that men and women give the most of themselves when they are permitted to attack problems which directly affect them. Yet the citizens of the District of Columbia, at the very seat of government created by our Constitution, have no vote in the government of their city. They are taxed without representation. They are asked to assume the responsibilities of citizenship while denied one of its basic rights. No major capital in the free world is in a comparable condition of disenfranchisement. Laid it straight out. How could this have happened? Well, the Congress got a conscience from time to time, and there were periods when the district had its full home rule. This is one of those periods. The Congress does not intervene into the life of this city except when individual matters disagree with a provision here or there of the city. Let me read from Richard Nixon, who signed the Home Rule Act. The district's citizens should not be expected to pay taxes for a government which they have no part in choosing, or to bear the full burdens of citizenship without the full rights of citizenship. I share the chagrin that most Americans feel at the fact that Congress continues to deny self-government to the nation's capital. I would remind the Congress that the Founding Fathers did nothing of the sort. Home rule was taken from the district only after more than 70 years of self-government, and this was done on grounds that were either factually shaky or morally doubtful. It is morally doubtful for any member of this body to assume he or she has the right to tell any citizen of the District of Columbia how to govern himself unless you are a member of the body that governs the District of Columbia. If that is a principle which applies to your district, it must apply to mine. So we greatly resent the fact that we are allowed to govern ourselves, except when some member decides that some matter would be controversial in his district. So therefore, he wants to deny this district the right to carry out that matter after that matter has become a matter of local law. Every framer would turn over in his grave to recognize that we could come to the 21st century in such a condition. Yet, and it took action in the 110th and 111th Congress to remove prohibitions on the district's use of local funds for medical marijuana, for needle exchange, for abortions for low-income women. In the 112th Congress, Republicans imposed the ban on the use of local funds for abortions. Who do they think they are? They are accountable to no one in the District of Columbia. They are in straight, sure violation of every principle of the founding document. I believe that in good faith, many members, especially newer members, are simply not aware of this history and not aware that it is grounded in the framers' documents themselves. That's why, instead of assuming that any member of this body would intentionally deny democracy to any American, I think the way to proceed is for this American, this member, this representative of the people of the District of Columbia to come forward on occasion with information and material that I hope members will take under advisement. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back the remainder of my time.